Welcome back. All right, so in light of the fact that Mike Babcock's in the news again, and we'll see where that goes, I wanted to talk about how the game has evolved, how the NHL's evolved. And so this comes down to a number of different factors that have changed the game. So it kind of turned into a madness board minus the magnets. Now, the original six era goes from 1942 to 1967. During this era, you have six teams in the NHL, almost all Canadian. Your coaches, a little more job security back then than what you have now. There was just the one coach behind the bench. And there were a couple of franchises that had some rough times during the original six era, but in general, things were pretty good for Montreal, for Toronto, and for Detroit during portions of that as well. But that being said, it would change in 1967. So the NHL, seeing that hockey was expanding, whether they wanted it to or not, they had six teams in 1967 to bring the total number of teams to 12. They took all six of those teams and gave them their own division. So the original six teams have a division. The other six teams have their own division, meaning that there's going to be teams missing the playoffs in the original six division that would have made the playoffs in the other division. So the NHL did what the NHL does. They managed to find a way to do it that the teams weren't necessarily all that happy. Eventually, the Chicago Blackhawks were moved into that other division. But in 1970, they add two teams to the NHL to bring the number to 14. 1972, they add two more, and they did it again in 1974. So we're up to 18 teams. 7 years before that, there were six. So there was a lot of talk about basically you have too many teams now, there's not enough players. And adding to that was the fact that the WHA is around. So you have almost the same amount of teams in 1974 between the WHA and the NHL as you have now in the NHL. And this was before we had a lot of European players. You didn't have a lot of guys in there who were of the skilled variety. So this is where you get into a lot of the enforcers being prominent, and the game was really quite different. 1978, the Barons merged with the Minnesota North Stars. That takes the NHL's number of teams down to 17. And that's the first time we had seen the number of teams drop since 1942, which was the start of the original six era. The NHL had more than 10 teams at a time before that, but those six, the original six, those were the surviving six teams. So 1979, a year later, the NHL expands by four WHA teams. The Quebec Nordiques, Hartford Whalers, Winnipeg Jets, Edmonton Oilers, right? And then in 1991, they add the Sharks. So we have a 12-year separation between the WHA being brought in, which means all the other WHA teams have gone by the wayside. Now we're down to 21 teams of players. We get a 22nd team in 91 when the San Jose Sharks come in. Two more teams are added a year later in Ottawa and Tampa. Two more teams are added a year later. That's Florida and Anaheim. And I think this is part of the reason why reporters keep hounding the National Hockey League about expansion, because really, traditionally, when the NHL expands, it expands by a bunch. Again, you go from 6 to 18 teams in 7 years, and then you go from 21 teams to 30 teams in less than a decade. So they added the Predators in 1998, they added the Thrashers in 1999, and in 2000 they had two more teams, bringing it to an even number of 30. And they stopped there. 2017, we see the Golden Knights added to bring the total number of teams to 31, and then in 2021, the Kraken joined the league, and we get to the current number of teams at 32. But that's part of the reason why people look at the NHL and say, so more expansion, because traditionally that's what they've done. Been just crazy, all kinds of expansion. They haven't been shy when they get into these expansion modes. And now the discussion is that it may be 2030 before we see more teams added. But now you've gone from 6 teams in 1967 to 32 teams in 2021, which means 60 years from now we'll have about 120 teams if it multiplies at the same rate. But the players by nationality is interesting too. So I found a list of active players, and this means not necessarily National Hockey League, but active players who've played in the NHL. 445 from Canada, 298 from the United States, 107 from Sweden, 62 from Russia, 55 from Finland, Czechia 41, Switzerland 12, Slovakia 10, Germany 8, Denmark 6, Latvia 5, Belarus 3, Austria 2, Netherlands, France, Australia, Slovenia, Uzbekistan, Norway 1. And technically, Georgiev is Bulgaria, but I believe he, by nationality, is Russian. So, at any rate, a lot of different countries. And again, if you look back to that 1967, you're going to find almost all Canadians. Very, very few Americans get in there. There are some Americans, yes, but comparatively speaking now, not so much. So at the start of last season, when you looked at the National Hockey League rosters, 294 players were Canadian, 202 were from the U.S., 67 Sweden, 40 from Russia, 33 Finland, 30 from Czechia, 9 from Switzerland, 8 from Slovakia, 7 from Germany, 3 from Belarus, 2 from Austria, and then France, Bulgaria, Slovenia, Uzbekistan, Norway, Netherlands, Australia all have 1. So a lot of countries, and it does show that while Canadians were dominating the league right up into the 70s, now they make up less than 50% of the league. And I don't expect that to change substantially this coming season. So the question of, Canadian dominance, how long will it last? I would think that at some point in time, it just kind of evens out. We'll probably have more Swedish players, more Finnish, Russian, Czechia, and it'll probably just kind of even out as the years go by. But that being said, Finland, Czechia, 2 examples of kind of smaller countries, might be more difficult for them, but we'll see, right? So the National Hockey League really was quite different back in the 60s. And if you watch hockey, and I've seen a lot of people like, look at the old games. Look at the old games. These teams sucked. These players sucked. A lot of it comes down to coaching. And it was really a north-south league. It was just straight up and down the ice. There wasn't the back and forth we have now. East-west hockey didn't exist. It was north-south. And when the NHL became more east-west, it's when the Soviet influence showed up. So 1972, you have the Summit Series between Canada and the Soviets. The Soviets played a completely different style of game. And we saw it again in the 80s when the Soviet Union would send a national team over, or they'd send over one of the teams from one of their leagues. I remember Kimmich coming over and going, wow, those jerseys are loud, they're ugly. I kind of need one. I remember that. And I was excited to get those cards from my O-Pee-Chee packs back in 1990. But they played a completely different style of game, and it was fascinating to watch. It was fascinating to watch a National Hockey League team out there against a team that's pass, shoot. Because in the NHL at that point, it's pass, shoot. So there was a lot more shots being taken by the National Hockey League players in those games, but a lot fewer hitting the net. And with the Soviet players, you could see like the precision was the key. Puck control was big. They would pass it. And it drove fans nuts because be like, well, this is totally different. Why don't they just shoot the puck? But when they did shoot the puck, they were far more accurate. So they would wait until they had the perfect opportunity and then they'd score. And they were really well coached. They were really smart with how they played the game. And then it started to change the way National Hockey League players have been playing. Now, prior to that, you had players from Sweden coming over. You had players from Finland coming over. Their skill wowed a lot of people. There was also a lot of discussion about these guys can't take the physical game. They're not built for that. And there was something to that in the beginning. There was definitely something to be said for how physical the North American game was and how, absolutely skillful the European game was. And so when you get the two together, yeah, the Canadian and American players could kind of wear down the European players via the physical side of the game. That is no longer anywhere near what it was back then. And I would say there are plenty of players out of Sweden, out of Finland, Russians who come over as well, who are, and any country on the board, really, they're physical. And if you don't have a last name on the back of their jersey and you don't know where they're from, I don't know that you can point and go, well, clearly that guy's European and clearly that guy's Canadian because look at how they play the game. It's far more of a homogenous experience now, whether you're watching a European game or an NHL game. There are still differences. There are differences in the rules, the ice size and everything. But the way that the game is played, the puck control, North American hockey now understands the puck control. The ability to play east-west is so much more important than what it was. Now, while all of that was being taught, one thing that was changing too was the coaching behind the bench. The first NHL assistant coach was in Philadelphia. Mike Nicoluk was hired by Fred Shero in 1972. And that was the first instance of a full-time assistant coach. Now, in looking through coaching staffs currently, some coaching staffs are not completely filled out. Most teams have between 3 and 5 different coaches, and that would include goalie coach, video coach, and these kinds of things. But generally, having assistant coaches and having that full coaching staff is just kind of seen as that's the way it's done. And it wasn't always seen that way. And when Roger Nielsen brought in the video and he became captain video and he was look at him, just video coach, There were some that thought that was kind of weird, and some that felt that it didn't really add anything. And well, that's not going to work. That's going to be a fad. I don't know why Roger's doing that. I never understood why Roger Nielsen didn't last very long in places as coach. He ended up being fired a lot more than I thought was justified. And he thought outside the box, and he definitely revolutionized the game by bringing in video. So while it may have caused some raised eyebrows at the time, and people were like, I don't know what this guy's thinking, now it's just part of the game. Having a video coach is seen as being a necessity by most National Hockey League teams. I don't know if all teams have a video coach, but I know most do, and if they don't, they're going to have one. I'm thinking it's standard, but the list I was looking at, not every team has an actual listed video coach I saw on that page. So Nielsen's changing the game. The Flyers hire an assistant coach. That starts the change to where we see assistant coaches everywhere. And European players coming over changes the game. And when European players came over and started changing the game, that's where a lot of the friction directed towards European players comes in. Like, no, we don't want your hockey over here. We don't want to play your style of hockey. Too late. Once that came in and once those players were successful, that style of hockey absolutely permeated all the way down to junior levels. And it absolutely, that evolution of the game took place. I will say in the mid to late 80s, we really saw that. As scoring was pretty high, there were a lot of good, talented forwards, and then the Iron Curtain comes down. So certain countries like former Soviet Union, former countries within that union, as well as the Czechoslovakia becoming Czech Republic and Slovakia, and all of the Iron Curtain coming down the way that it did, it allowed that liberal movement of European players to come over, and it really changed the game very quickly. You look at Stanley Cup playoff games in 1986 and compare them to Stanley Cup playoff games in 1996, you would see a big difference in play, and a lot of that would be European players coming over, teams more widely using video, and just a change in the style of play. So this is why when I hear, well, these players, look at the highlights from the 80s, it was a completely different game. It was coached completely different. It's not fair to look at players in the 80s and say, well, clearly they weren't very good, because it was absolutely not the same game that we have now. So 1979, the NHL decided we better protect the head. Helmets are mandatory, but we'll grandfather it in. If you played before we brought this in, don't worry about it. You don't need to wear a helmet. So you had players in the 80s who didn't wear helmets. I believe Craig McTavish was the last one that didn't wear a helmet. 2013 visors became mandatory. Now, what's funny about this is, at the time that both of those became mandatory, there was outcry. There was outcry that if you make helmets mandatory, and then with visors, it was the same argument. You get more high sticks. There's going to be more guys doing cheap shots. By not having the helmet, by not having the visor, it keeps players honest. Players will keep their sticks down. There won't be the ugly incidents that we'd have if we have the visors or the helmets. We won't have those without. And yet, if you look at hockey history, a lot of ugly incidents pre-1979. So I don't think that the game now has the same level of ugly incidents. Mike Milbury with the shoe. Just as an example, right? We don't see that as much now. You don't see guys scaling the glass to go after the crowd quite as much as we may have back in the day. So I don't think that we've seen that increase in stick work that was expected, right? And it's really, when I've heard that, I've always thought people just don't want the game to change. They just don't want the game to change, right? That's part of it. But what's interesting is mouth guards are not mandatory, but over 90% of hockey players wear mouth guards. And you're at the point now where if you see a player without a mouth guard, you assume he probably dropped it on the ice. Where's his mouth guard? So and they don't all wear them properly. Hello, Matthew Tkachuk, just sitting there and just chewing on it, which looks kind of gross. But anyways, the mouth guards are not mandatory, but players have realized they want to keep their teeth longer. You look back in the 70s and 80s, and players generally didn't have their front teeth a lot of the time. Bobby Clark's toothless smile became famous, right? However, players have used jocks/cups since 1874. So that's always been kind of a running joke that players realized that they had to protect their groin in the 1870s, and it took over 100 years for them to realize that wearing head protection was just as important as the groin. And even then, it was grandfathered in, right? So, it's a league that's had to be dragged kicking and screaming sometimes through some changes. So the game has evolved, and I know the game's going to evolve further. I don't have any concern, even though I'm Canadian, about, if Canada's not going to be the power of the sport anymore. I always assume that if it does become more and more global, if we see more and more countries playing the game, yeah, then that's going to erode Canada's place at the top. Player salaries has been a big change too. So one big difference between back in the original six era and now is how much power the players have. So it starts with the union, and Ted Lindsay started this ball rolling, and when he tried to, they basically traded him to the Blackhawks, which at the time it was an awful move to go from the Detroit Red Wings to Chicago, a team that was, at the bottom and not perceived very well. And it was done as a punishment to Ted Lindsay. You could not get away with that now. Look back at the John Scott incident, right? Fans are trying to get John Scott into the All-Star game. He gets traded. He's in the AHL. I don't know how much the NHL had to do with all of the things that were going on with John Scott, but as fans, they held their feet to the fire, and the NHL had to relent and allow him to be in the All-Star game. And then they changed the rules so you can't get a John Scott into the All-Star game again because we're not allowed to have fun. But that shows how different things are now from how they were back then. That back then players could be punished. They could be traded. I've talked numerous times about Lanny McDonald's trade to Colorado because the Toronto Maple Leafs were having a problem in their communications with Darryl Sittler and decided to send a message by trading his best friend Lanny McDonald because they couldn't trade Darryl Sittler. You couldn't get away with that now. You couldn't get away with it. There's just no way that you would see a team trading a top player just because they're having a feud with one of the other players on the team. Well, I cannot imagine the Montreal Canadiens. Well, we traded Cole Caulfield because we're kind of mad at Nick Suzuki, but he's got a no-trade clause, so we traded Caulfield just to send a message to him. Nope, that wouldn't fly now. So there's definitely been a shift in terms of players and the amount of control they have over where they play, over how they play, even, I would say, where they can refuse a coach's recommendation if they feel like the coach is asking too much or it's going to hurt their game. There's a lot less risk now to players with their jobs than there used to be. Not that there's no risk, there still is. And now it's kind of gone the other way, where for the coach, you kind of got to keep your nose clean. And so that's why when we see, things about Mike Babcock, who, today is again kind of in hot water, and there's a lot of discussion about the methods he's bringing to Columbus. These are things that if they had happened back in previous generations, people would have said, look, he's the boss. He's the boss. He's the coach. And you kind of got to do what the coach wants. And we've seen some coaches evolve with the game. And I use John Tortorella as an example. And I think that's a good example because his coaching style has absolutely changed over the last 10 years. His style, and I felt like after his time in Vancouver that he took a lot out of that 1 year. That he realized, this style doesn't work, I need to change. And in Columbus, it felt like his style of coaching was different than it had been in Vancouver, and now we're seeing that in Philadelphia as well. I feel like there's fewer blow-ups, there's fewer problems with players on the team. Not that there's none. I'm not saying that because that's unrealistic. You've got players with egos, you've got coaches with egos, and you're going to have a clash between them at different points in time. You're never going to have a situation where every player thinks coach is great or every player thinks coach sucks. You're going to have players that like unpopular coaches, and you're going to have players who dislike popular coaches as well. There may be various reasons for that, but the game has changed so much from what it was when I started watching it back in, and I use 1981 as the example when I started watching a lot. But there were games I watched as early as, I would say 1979 was probably the first time I watched at least parts of games. So I would have been, 5-6 years of age at that point. And then I have memories of the Buffalo Sabres knocking out Vancouver in 1981 and really jumping into those playoffs after, Vancouver gets taken out. But it is a completely different world than what it was then. And I feel like while there are still those that'll point and say that team has too many Europeans to win, it's nowhere near the amount of people that would say it back then. And I feel like that evolution is just going to continue. One thing that we respect more now is defensive play. Back in the 80s, it really wasn't a whole lot said about it. If a guy was a forward, the joke was you got to introduce him to the goalie at the end of the year because the goalie hasn't seen him all year. You can't get away with that now like you did back then. How many times do we talk about a star player and you'll see immediately somebody comment, yeah, but he doesn't play defense. Nobody would have cared in the 80s. That just wasn't a thing. It was, go out there and score 3 points a game. Who cares if you play defense? You scored 3 points in that game. But now you can see situations where a player could be around a point per game, and the conversation changes from he's a good player to he doesn't play defense. I think the guy's garbage. Which, again, back then, didn't really happen. That didn't really come in until you get to the dead puck era in 95. 95, when that dead puck era really takes over. The Devils get to that Stanley Cup. They win that Stanley Cup. And they get there through really smart defense and really smart European-style hockey as well. That puck control, that just make sure they don't have it. Make sure they're not getting shots. We don't care if we're getting too many shots, but make sure ours are higher quality than theirs and play that defensive style. And it worked. And it started really making its way through the league. And that's when we started to see more scrutiny about offensive stars and whether or not they play defense. Because when you're in a league where there's a lot less goals being scored, that guy who allows that goal to go in because maybe he's at the other end of the ice, he doesn't come back, he doesn't back check, he's kind of floating. That is far more noticeable when all of your games are 2-1 and 3-2 than when it's 6-5, 6-4, 7-5, 80s style, right? And so I do wonder if with the scoring going up the way that it has over the last few years, do we start to see maybe a shift where people say, yeah, he's not great defensively, but look at the offense? We may start seeing some of that. I think we've seen that with some players, but I do wonder if that'll become more prominent as the game continues to evolve. So for a coach like Mike Babcock and for some of the older coaches in the National Hockey League, they either evolve with this or they're just not going to be in the league that long. Because no matter what your coaching style is, if you're not able to coach for the game the way that it's being played right now, you're not going to be in the league that long. And this is why I agree with some people that there are coaches who stick around a little too long at the National Hockey League level. Like there's a lot of good coaches in junior, there's a lot of good coaches in Europe. I think that once a team finally takes that plunge and hires a European coach and has a little bit of success, we will then see other teams emulate that. It's just that teams that have hired European coaches over the last 25 years have not had that level of success. Chicago with Alpo Suhonen. Ralph Kruger kind of qualifies as a European, although he's lived in North America a long time as well. But at some point in time, I do think we'll see a European coach. When? It's going to have to be a team that looks outside the box. Oddly enough, ironically, I kind of would have thought Columbus would think about it. You've got Jarmo Kekalainen as your GM. You would think maybe he would consider it, but he goes with Babcock trying to get the Columbus Blue Jackets back into the hunt for a playoff spot. So, there you go. A little bit of evolution, both in terms of teams in the league, players and their nationality, the way the game that it's played, and I thought players by nationality was important for that because this is why the game changed. You got all these players from Europe, and it also means that all of this expansion is justified. You could not have 32 teams of just Canadian players. So you have to have, not at the talent level we have now in the NHL, you have to have those players from European countries. Or, yeah, you don't have enough really good high-quality talent to fill out a full 32 team league. You'd probably end up with a lot of low-scoring games, probably a lot of defense, a lot of trapping hockey. One thing to keep in mind, too, is when there's expansion, scoring normally goes up. I've seen some discussion about whether or not that's why the scoring's up now in the NHL, but this is only 2 teams. So back in the 90s, that was 8 teams they added in like 7 years. And again, you go from 6 teams to 18 over a 7-year period. That's a huge drain of talent that you're just dragging into the league. So no, I don't think adding 2 teams has necessarily made a big difference to the scoring in the NHL. I think it's just the evolution of the game. So let me know your thoughts in the comments section below. As always, don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you're browsing your way through. You just happened upon this video. Thank you guys so much for watching, for all your support. I will talk to you again soon.